I'm the daughter of an immigrant and the mother of one as well, legal immigrants. In fact, my daughter and my mother both took oaths they would never be dependent on the American taxpayer, and their families would not be dependent on that. And we really do learn when we have to teach someone else. I'm also the wife of a godly husband, and I wouldn't be here if it was for my husband, Jim, as we have a responsibility to teach our daughter and this generation how they're going to make it, how we're going to adapt in a way that they're going to be able to transmit their values successfully to their heirs. And culture, you know, we use that word a lot, but we don't often analyze what it is. But culture is the means by which we transmit knowledge, values, and beliefs from one generation to the next. And this is from definition of Professor Reuven Feuerstein. He's the man who tutored Piaget's children, if you've ever heard of child psychology before. Reuven died just a year ago this week, actually. Very good man. In fact, this is Reuven here, and his son, this is Reuven, and this is his son, Rafi, and we work with their institute in Israel. Reuven was a cognitive, a developmental, and a clinical psychologist, and as a Romanian-born Jew, he understood what it meant for the survival of culture. That's intergenerational transmission of values. The Jews have done pretty well at that for the last 4,000 years. He was assigned to Palestine when it wasn't named Israel yet, as it has recently been, but he was to educate the Jews from the Holocaust who had grown up on the streets of Europe and Northern Africa without family, without parents. And these youth were labeled as being ineducable. But these youth are who is running Israel today, and obviously Israel is where you want to go if you're going to have something happen. You want to go to Israel, not to the other side there. So my mother grew up in a war zone and under communism, socialism, and Hitler's fascism. And she and her twin were placed in Hitler Youth at age 7. My grandparents did have a distinct advantage, though, because they knew they were raising their children in a war zone. And they prepared their children in 5 distinct ways. Faith. Number 1, they had a solid faith in Jesus Christ. That was undeniable. He would be their anchor. They also had family. They had a secure family attachment. We're going to talk about what secure attachment does for children, for the development of the mind, self-regulation. And they looked towards the future. And future meaning they would have a work ethic, they would know how to work, and education. All of the children would have a profession, they would be able to provide for themselves, and they transmitted insight, past, present, and projected future. They also planned to transmit a fortune to their children. They had 60 hired hands that worked on their properties. And of course they had to leave all that behind when they fled that area. But we're not leaving our children any fortune. You know, $130 trillion of debt and liabilities is not a good inheritance. And they also understood the value of freedom and the difference between freedom and liberty. Liberty is different than freedom, and we can talk about that too. The U.S. Declaration of Independence recognizes that mankind is granted inalienable rights from their Creator God. Reuven Feuerstein and the Jews recognize this truth. My grandparents recognize this truth. And despite unparalleled odds, they knew that man was created in the image of God, his likeness, and with him, all things are possible. What do you believe? And what will future generations believe? We're living in what is now called a posthuman era. And it means just what it says. Today, be it the use of behavioral science, Heidi mentioned a little bit to that, mated with technology, societies are now able to make or produce beings that are no longer human. As a man thinks, he acts. So let's talk about thinking. Brought my little prop with me. Ta-da. Stand up. Does anybody know what this is? It's a picture up there. This is a neuron. This is a building block of how you think. You know, you've got a spirit, but you have to think also. You've got some reasoning that's going on here. So we have this cell body in the middle here, and we've got our little radiating dendrites off the side. Now I put some yellow on mine because that's supposed to be my myelin, so I have a healthy dendrite here, a healthy neuron, and these in the bottom are the terminal end buds. Actually, when we do these presentations, I sometimes have the audience make those, and it's kind of a fun thing, but we didn't have enough time today. The neuron is the basic building block of our nervous system. It's what allows us to sense the environment, our eyes, ears, taste, touch, smell, all those things. So there's sensory neurons. It's also what allows us to respond to that world. It's our motor, it's our action, it's what we do. And then there's interneurons. Those are neurons that communicate between other neurons. That's what is our gray matter. We talk about the gray matter of the brain. That's the gray matter, those cells. Neuronal dendrites are those little things I have here, projections. These communicate with another dendrite. Dendrites are good. We want more dendrites. We want more dendrites because that means connections are happening. We're getting more paths, we're getting more networking, we're getting more ideas, and we want ideas. They transmit information, and this is what scared me. We drove in from Fort Wayne, and we went through all those wind turbines. Oh my goodness, I know what those are doing to malformations of people and animals, and I'm like going, oh my gosh, you don't want that. And then we went through one where it had the wind turbines plus the power lines. I'm going, oh, we don't want any people living in that property. And I noticed there weren't any animals around there. But we're electrical. I mean, that's what it is. It's a change in membrane potentials, the voltage difference between the cell membrane in response to that stimuli in chemical neurotransmitters. That's how we transmit information. It's how we think. It's how we do thinking, memory, and learning. Those receptor sites have things that fit in them, and those are called neurotransmitters or hormones. And that's how we have a change, and that's how we have our thought processes occur. Neurotransmitters, this response depends on the type of neurotransmitter and its effects that's going to be on that specific neuron. So some of these neurotransmitters can be excitatory, arousal, that's like pushing on the accelerator, or inhibitory, putting on the brake. Or it can be both. It really depends on the neuron and the concentration of the neurotransmitter and what it's going to do. Glutamate, that's one we all know about. We know about monosodium glutamate. You've heard of that before. Monosodium glutamate, or glutamate, is the #1 neurotransmitter in the brain. It's also neurotoxic. It's meant to be kept inside the cells. It's not meant to be in your food swimming around, actually killing your brain cells. Epinephrine is another excitatory. GABA is calming. Histamine, we get our allergies. That's another one that's excitatory. Dopamine does both. It says smooth body movements. If you know someone with Parkinson's disorder, they have trouble with the amount of dopamine that they have. Acetylcholine, serotonin. Some people take melatonin to go to sleep at night. That's actually a calming one. Or people crave carbohydrates. It's to try to create more serotonin. Taurine, another one. So we need to realize that we are affected by those things. Now, the white matter is myelin. That was my little yellow that I put on here, but these nerves are wrapped in a lipid protein substance, and that's called myelin. It acts as an insulation sheath to increase the speed, the electrical conductance of the nerve impulse. And this white matter is the infrastructure. It's the basis of thinking and acting, not always in that order, because much of what we do is subconscious and reflexive. In fact, we can be trained to do a lot of things that become reflexive and not really thinking. Now you notice in this one, we've got the myelin covering that, and this is a cross section over here, which means that you've taken a cut through that axon right there, and this is the wrapping. That's literally that myelin that goes around there. So again, it's like if you have a house and you have plastic over those wires because you want to have that conduction go faster. And myelin increases the conduction speed, and we get more myelin by using what we have, making more connections, thinking about it. It's called cerebration, cerebrating, physical movement, and that creates muscle memory, and even in our physical bodies, and procedural memory. But you got to be careful who's building a brain and what they're building into it. This is also the same reason that concert pianists practice about 6 hours a day, and they don't need the written music to look at anymore. It's because they've practiced it so much that it becomes part of their muscle memory. They don't even need to look at the music, it's in there. Now we need both the gray matter, those neurons, and we need the white matter, because the white matter is the structure that supports that gray matter. And it's like building a house. We're either going to have this house built on solid rock or sinking sand. And the problem is that the white matter that's built using digital technology or screen time is not structurally sound. And these minds are headed for collapse or disfigurement. We'll talk about the figures in that in just a minute. Due to the lack of the supporting white matter, the gray matter, those cells are also destined for collapse because there is nothing to support them. The support for these are called oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. And those cells are what provide the nutrition, the support, the feeding, that connection of the impulse going by. And that's not happening. So how does all that relate to what's been happening to Americans about the last 50 years? By the outsourcing of parenting. And I have to say, people have really outsourced parenting. These children are not learning disabled. They're teaching disabled and they're parent disabled. The parents have not taken responsibility for educating their children. And that's sad to say, but anybody who's in the education system knows that because they're stuck with this problem. By the use of behavioral science, federal funding, control of education, which we've talked about, and it's aligned, as we said, for its labor force development. This increasing use of technology and digital media and data collection is nearly in every aspect of our culture. And we have some people that have noticed this. This isn't new, except the rest of us have been sleeping for a long time. But through the cacophonous chorus of post-war planners runs one harmonious theme. The individual must surrender more and more of his rights to the state, which will in turn guarantee him what is euphemistically called security. Or our friend Friedrich Hayek, he's an Austrian economist, planning leads to dictatorship. The direction of economic activity inevitably necessitates the suppression of freedom. Economic control is not merely control of a sector of human life which can be separated from the rest. It is the control of the means for our ends. And whoever has sole control of the means must also determine the ends that are to be served, which values are to be rated higher and lower, and in short, what men should believe and strive for. He was kind of laughed at when he wrote that book in 44, and now everybody, realizes how true it is. The question, who does grant rights to individuals, God or men? We're living in a culture that is hostile to Judeo-Christian worldview, and we've arrived because whoever controls the education and the media controls the culture. Skinner's operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner. If you read the little part in blue there, the consequences of an act affect the probability of its occurring again. It's absolutely right. Unfortunately, B.F. Skinner was also at Indiana University. He was on the faculty there. He's the father of behavioral science, operant conditioning. You get a positive reward if you do something good. You get a negative punishment if they don't like that behavior. It's training people like dogs. It's what we do. He was the department chair for the Department of Psychology in Indiana University. One of my degrees is from IU, and I'm not really proud of it. You realize Indiana is the first state in the world to have a forced sterilization law in 1907? And you saw it happen to Indiana 2 weeks ago with our Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Fascism 101. That's absolutely it. The corporate power that pulled that on the people is an abomination. And Hoosiers should be embarrassed by that. In fact, we can speak what happens to Common Core because we have Indiana Common Core college and career ready standards. B.F. Skinner's teaching machines. He had a dream of teaching machines, and his methods are used in all these areas. And these teaching machines, he actually had one for his children. He had made some for animals and for his own kids. Anyway, this is what we have today. E-learning, electronic learning. We have areas in Indiana that have been on iPads K through 12 for 5 years already. Believe me, we're seeing what's happening to the brains, what's not happening. Digital computers, iPads, laptops. We've got toddlers that are on iPads and technical media. The brains are not growing. It's how you train a dog or an animal. If you're going to treat people as animals because you believe in Darwin, then this is how you're going to train them, just like you do an animal. And we get those stickers, we get all those kind of things. People get them too. Older people get them too, all their rewards cards. It's used in nearly every area, as well as by parents who know how to do this to your children. It's not a good way to coerce your children to do something for that external activity because you don't train self-thinking students. You don't train people that can have self-government if you're all going to be externally controlled by whatever reward. Behavioral conditioning is successful because the outside sensory stimulus produces an internal result, those neurotransmitters. Thus, there is a neurochemical addiction. Altered brains, post-humans, animals. Rewards are not bad, but for the individual that is created in the image of God, the rewards are supposed to be intrinsically motivated. Our personal responsibilities do require the use of our faculties, our private property, to provide for ourselves and our families and those incapable of labor. But you're going to either use your faculties for honest labor, or you're going to plunder someone else and use that for the property of others. Take that way. We're living in a sensory-driven culture of technology manipulation. And for the 50-plus last years of denying our Christian heritage, it's been catalyzed by this unrestricted use of technology and media, which is literally drowning the sensory systems of our citizens. The sensory systems include auditory, your hearing, and we can look at my little pointer over here. So the auditory portion would be over here close to your ears, and your visual portion is going to be, actually, your vision actually goes through the whole brain. That's why we study so much neurobiology and neurology and vision. Because even though your eyes are clear up here, all of that information spreads out into every one of these areas, and finally these areas back here are the visual cortex. Tactile would be with your fingers touching, since there's your somatic areas here, somaesthetic here. Your vestibular is your balance. Like if you get dizzy when you go to the roller coaster, that's your vestibular system. Proprioceptive is that ability to tell where your joints are, your muscles, that feeling of your weight. Taste, I think we know about that, and smell. Now the more senses that are engaged, the greater the integration is. And this is why the technology is so dangerous. Because sensory systems respond to change. Something new, something novel. So once the newness is detected, the system adapts, it habituates, until another change occurs in intensity, locale, color, lighting, speed, smell. Now, as adaptation and habituation continue, in order to register a change, the stimuli must be louder, more shocking, more intense, more scintillating in order to be noticed. Those of you that go to a big church can talk about this. Our music is so loud because really a lot of people are losing their hearing. Many young people. In young people today, there's a greater percentage of hearing loss than there are in senior citizens because of the use of the media, the iPods and things like that. So eventually what happens is there's a breaking point. The human system can't take it anymore. I was going to have you do this earlier, but if you take your hand, I'll use my left hand, but okay, here's your hand. This front part here is going to be that frontal lobe, and this part here is going to be your parietal lobe. This is your temporal lobe right here. Now if you open it up, this little thumb part here is your limbic system. So this drawing here actually is showing is what's inside deeper. This is your limbic system, okay? This limbic, the amygdala, the hippocampus, all this around here, thalamus, hypothalamus. These are actually your olfactory, coming from your smell. Smell actually goes directly to the amygdala. That's why smell is such a very, has a powerful effect on people. So the thalamus and the amygdala are responsible for the interpretation of the sensory information that comes in. What you see, what you hear, taste, touch, smell, feel. And they act as a triage nurse to decide, oh dear, is this shocking? Do we need to fight, flight, or fright? And they also use the hippocampus. The hippocampus is really one of the only areas of the brain that has what's called neogenesis, where you can make new neurons. The rest of the brain, you get what you get, and that's it. And if you kill it, you don't have any more. So this is where memory occurs. And the hippocampus is formed by about 18 months. So if you take your tongue in your mouth, put it to the roof of your mouth, a little bit towards the back, right in there, that's about where you'll be, right where your limbic system is, right above there. The limbic is. And that's why some people like sucking on a piece of candy. That's why kids suck on their fingers sometimes, or their thumb. It's actually a calming effect that's happening doing that. Life in the limbic system is not where you want to have your child or you be. It's not thinking, because it's not thinking on the higher cortical levels. It's thinking on more the animal instinct. And most children from hard places come with a limbic system that has been highly fear conditioned. I know, we have one. But increasingly, biological children are also coming from hard places because they're not attaching to their parents. Most children today are wards of the state, the social emotional herd, due to a materialistic planned economy, workforce development, socialism, fascism, communism. Many, perhaps even most children today do not have a secure attachment to their own parents. And as a result, they are missing the functions of the middle prefrontal lobe, this part right up here. You know what? You better have your middle prefrontal lobe. But we got to take a commercial from that. We're talking about music of the hemispheres. The left and the right. We talk about people being left brain or right brain. You really want to be both left and right brain. So I'm going to make you people, you get to be the left brain, which actually is a good thing to be. And the right brain is going to be over here. So, got that? Now, The left hemisphere of the brain is characterized by linear, logical, linguistic, that means talking, literal, mathematical. The left brain analyzes things and it explains the world. I'm going to tell you how the clock is made. It's very explicit, very detail-oriented, very sequential, chronological, systematic, rational, factual, abstract. Yes, abstract. Abstract is a funny term, but yes, we need to think abstractly. We can't always think just keep us in a concrete playpen. We need to have ideas that we carry in our heads. We have linguistic definitions of words, syllogistic meaning syllogistic reasoning, cause and effect logic, and it's very objective. There is an absolute of right and wrong. We have truth, okay? We believe in truth. We think of a lot of engineers as being left brain, okay? Now the right hemisphere, we need the right hemisphere too, but we don't need it to be running things. But the right hemisphere is very holistic, kind of gestalt, it's a very picture-oriented. Everything is a picture. Nonverbal symbols, very artsy, metaphorical. I kind of think this, I can't tell you how I thought of that, but it just came to me. It just jumped in there. It describes the world from a personal aspect, very subjective. Well, in my opinion, what other opinion is there? It's everything is according to how I view things, how I want to perceive things. It's all my narrative, or one that's been uploaded into me as an opinion. We work with people in Europe, and in Europe, everything is about someone's opinion. They've never read the work of whatever. They just know that so-and-so's opinion. They've learned to very much parrot that because of the PISA, which is a good test in socialism. Now, we get to have, this man standing in the bridge. He's taking our video here. But he's in the bridge, the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is the bridge between the left brain and the right brain, back and forth. And it's a nice, like kind of that median in the highway that lets you turn only at certain turns, like you can't do the big U turns in Texas. But we need that, because otherwise we'd have you trying to talk to you in an unorganized, really haphazard fashion. So there needs to be a good way to prevent interference between the two sides of the brain. And yes, women typically have more of a corpus callosum. We do a lot more multitasking, for good or for bad, maybe more emotional. Now, the frontal assault. We talked about the frontal part again. We're going to talk about the frontal lobe because this is really important. And what happens when the driver's seat of the car is empty? It's kind of where education is now. No one's driving the bus. It's empty. So this over here is this prefrontal lobe. I had to make your hand kind of thing too. Again, with your little fist, you can do that. But you can see this is your prefrontal area. This is the premotor area, motor area. This is again, that somaesthetic area. And we talked about these things before. This area here is really important. It's called the sensory speech area, but it's really interpreting all of these areas. It's interpreting the sensory area, the auditory, the motor for speaking area, and it's also interpreting all the visual association area. And you'll notice, you'll get a bonus point, but do you know which side of the brain this is? Can anybody guess which side of the brain? Pardon? Yes, this is the left side of the brain. This stuff is not on the right side of the brain. Do you know that 95% of people, language, Wernicke's, Broca's, all of this area is on the left side of the brain, for good reason, because it's your fact arsenal. It is where you verify truth, or what you've been told is truth. The right side of the brain is Miss Artsy. She doesn't have all those facts over there. She can interpret things, but she doesn't have the information there. Now we got the middle prefrontal cortex, this part here that's so important, and I'll go through these pretty quickly, but you better have this. This regulates your autonomic nervous system, balancing your parasympathetic and sympathetic systems, your excitatory and inhibitory. It's your attunement in communication, your ability to really understand when you talk to people. It's your emotional balance. It's your response flexibility, ability to pause before you think. It's your insight, past, present, anticipated, future. It's your empathy. And empathy is different than compassion. Empathy actually tries to get inside someone else's skin. Compassion walks beside, but empathy really is able to almost go inside that person's mind and think how they're going to act. And that's important when you're doing anything, teaching, whatever it is, working. Fear modulation. When you've had a fear, what happens is that's embedded in the amygdala of the limbic system. And the way we have to unlearn that fear is that there is a growing down of fibers, again, from this frontal lobe down to our limbic system here, down to the amygdala, and that releases GABA, that calming transmitter again. And what's interesting is those first 7 functions are present in secure attachment. why children need to be with their parents in safe attachment and not in a government preschool, which we have in Indiana. 12 of cities do that. The middle prefrontal lobe also is your intuition, that gut feeling that you feel you have this gut feeling that something's not right. That's also from that middle prefrontal lobe. And it's also your morality, where the moral good comes from, that you're going to carry it out even when no one's watching you. That's that sense of morality. So to summate that, this middle prefrontal lobe is what prevents distractibility and impulsivity. It keeps mental functions directed towards a goal. The elaboration of thought increases the depth of thought, the ideas, the abstraction, and it begins the coding for storage of memory and recall so that you carry things in your mind. It allows you to plan for the future and allows you to delay an action in response to that sensory information instead of just hitting someone in the face when maybe you should think, they are a lot bigger than I am, maybe I shouldn't do that. It allows you to consider the consequences before you do them, and allows you to solve some complicated sequences of problems, mathematical, legal, or philosophical problems, and allows you to correlate all these different areas of information and to control one's activities in a sense with moral laws. This is summing up what self-regulation is. And we have to be a self-regulating people, or else something else is going to control us. Now, that prefrontal lobe is largely formatted by age 3. People that don't have that prefrontal lobe act impulsively. They have a lack of most morals, and they're very quick to change their moods from joy, hate, sadness, exhilaration, sweetness, and rage. Very quick. So what happens is they end up being very distractible, lack of ability to control themselves, and they're very much in immediate gratification. There is no thinking about the future. It's all about now. Just meet my needs now. And so this is largely driven by the limbic system, that fight, flight, or fright, and the subjective right brain. Their left brains are empty of facts because those take time to focus. Because you actually have to take time to think about those things, and we're going to give a time frame on that in a minute. You have to focus, you have to rehearse, you have to consolidate in order to make these connections in your brain, to make more dendrites. It's not happening. Secure attachment is not happening in children today because families are broken. Techno-media has replaced relationships, creating wards of state, cradle to corpse. Most government-schooled children have become essentially wards of state. There's a huge push to have them socialized, and a lot of that is social emotional learning. E-learning is doing that. There's also a push for mindfulness. We've seen this in a couple cities in Indiana now, and this is they're using the form of transcendental meditation, like a calming. Oh, we're going to have a quiet time, a group clear your mind kind of thing. And that's Bloomington is doing that in several areas, and we've had it in Fort Wayne before too. And again, it goes along with the state of the global village kind of thing, which. Interesting, the Federalist, which the editor for that is a friend of mine, Joy Pullman. We're blessed to have the Pullmans in Fort Wayne. I love them. In fact, we're starting a classical Christian school with the Pullmans because we got to put some options out for people because the government schools are done and not everybody feels qualified to homeschool. But anyway, they had an article this week talking about Hillary Clinton. Oh, my goodness. And she's again advocating her Common Core, and that the parents are really not in charge of the children. It's all about the global thing of the village, is raising your kids. Now, parents are attaching to the media devices. The average parent spends 11 hours a day on the media, on screen time. The parents are attached more to technology than they are to their children, so they're not attaching to their children. So the children are attaching to the media, and they can't self-regulate. So the children are attaching to techno-nanny, and the state, and to each other. And so we've got this blind herd of kids just trampling around wherever the technology is leading them. The average child today spends more than 7 hours a day on screen time. Handheld media, iPads, e-learning, smartphones, laptops, whatever. And it's interesting because we're now seeing a 20% loss of gray and white matter in the brains. It's a compromised structure, compromised function, there's faulty connectivity, there's an overall loss of brain thickness throughout the youth that are being used on this technical media. And that's pretty scary because that brain, that doesn't really come back. Once you lose those, they're gone. So you wonder, as Heidi talked about, creating people to be consumers for somebody's technology junk. You know what I'm saying? This is not what we want. And it's funny, you know, the Walmart family is part of the big proponents of that, along with the Gates and the Lumina Foundation and Academy for Systemic Change, all of those folks. They're all into that together. The Hewlerts are big in that as well. Sandra Day O'Connor, she's got her part in it too. Now, the results of this rampant use of technomedia and screen time is we have an attention deficit, a lack of focus, reduced ability to prioritize, all of those things. We're very impulsive. We have what's called now in our manual, the Internet Addiction Disorder, the DSM-5 that just came out. We literally have now a diagnosis called Internet Addiction Disorder, as well as the sleep texting disorder, the phantom texting one. And we have video gaming addiction. China and South Korea have been on this media fast or feast a little bit longer than we have. And the reports are over 14% of youth in China, 14% have internet addiction disorder. And the Chinese are also losing their ability to write their language because they're so used to texting it and keypadding it, but they can't write their characters anymore. You know, there's over 3,000 characters in the Chinese language, and these children can't write them anymore. So it's estimated that these numbers are as high in the United States, but nobody wants to be doing a study on that because it doesn't pay by the bogus philanthropists. So this is a chemical addiction. These are driven by those neurotransmitters that we talked about. With each time your cell phone rings, which I've appreciated, we haven't had a lot of those, you get a success, a hit of dopamine, and that comes from the nucleus accumbens. So you think you did something. You didn't do anything, but you think you did because you got a ding. And so it feels good. And then when you have increased angst or anxiety on your gaming thing, your e-learning for rewards, you're going to get epinephrine and cortisol that's pushed out into the system. Now the problem is that epinephrine and cortisol on the brain ends up being like bleach on the brain. And dopamine in high amounts is aggression, which is not good. The cerebellum, and this is primarily what they're targeting for, is the limbic system and the cerebellum. The right brain is just this picture there, but the cerebellum is this little pink thing down here. Okay, the cerebellum is those things you don't think about. It's walking, it's talking, it's riding your bike. It carries memory in it too. So what happens when people play video games on the computer as well, pushing the button all the time, it just becomes reflexive. You don't think about frontal lobe or even in the left brain or anything like that. All you're doing is just pushing. My husband has trained some interns that are younger people, and they'll just punch through screens. You know, he's an engineer. They don't even look what it says. They're just punching for the next one to see if they can find another screen there. Memory is stored all over the brain, all over the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the cerebellum. So in this cortex up here, which is that part that separates us from animals, you have cognitive, that's thinking memory. The limbic system is emotional memory, what we talked about, that fear conditioning. And the midbrain is the motor vestibular memory. And the brainstem is the memory, like keeping your heart and things like that going. Memory takes 5 to 10 minutes to start a memory trace. So you don't just get it by punching a screen and looking at a different picture. You got to think about it. You got to rehearse it. So you have to rehearse that for minimal consolidation in 60 minutes to get more of a maximal consolidation. So flipping screens all the time is not going to get you anything you remember. It's going to keep your memory over in that iPad, smartphone, whatever. In fact, they're finding that now. Kids don't have any vocabulary. They cannot articulate anything. So memory is such that you have to keep rehearsing it or you lose it. If you don't keep repeating that again, the brain will prune itself and get rid of some of that. So memory that's not used is going to get pruned. You need to be selective how you build a brain. It's a horrible thing to disfigure a mind, and that's exactly what's happening. We have minds that are very disfigured now because no one's been careful about how you build them. The human neurobiology is not immune to the constant bombardment of stimuli. Thus, we have the term sensory overload, sensory manipulation, and exponential numbers of children who cannot habituate to this, with ADD, Asperger's, all kinds of things, autism, all kinds of sensory processing things, anxiety. And actually we have a lot of increase in suicides in young people. Germany has one of the highest rates of suicides. China, very high rate. Digital technology using these devices promotes attention deficit and learning disorders. In fact, Reuven and both his son, he were over here in the United States. The first thing he said was, you Americans are teaching attention deficit. And that is a huge thing because when we talk about learning, we have input, we have input functions, we have elaboration functions, thinking, and we have output functions. The number one part of the input is focusing and perceiving. If you can't focus and perceive, if you didn't get it in the first place, there's nothing to elaborate with. These are dependent on that. So if you don't get it in right to start with, you don't have anything to work with. So what's happening is we're omitting entirely the reasoning frontal lobe and the left side, which should have some facts in it. It's interesting that Steve Jobs of Apple would not allow his children on digital media. These people know what they're doing. And the American Pediatric Association guidelines, and these are the Canadian as well, no digital screen time for children under 2, less than 1 hour for those up to 6, and only 2 hours for children up to 18 years old. Yet we have government school systems that are pushing 7 and 8 hours of technology alone for children. There's a real disconnect here. Oh, let me mention this, ADD du jour. It's a clarification on attention deficit. You don't have to be wiggling around to have ADD, because now you can trounce around the internet. You just keep pushing another button. So you're feeding that whole thing by letting kids hop, 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 hop. Oh yeah, they look like they're engaged. Well, they're engaged because they're taking their ADD out, hopping around on the internet. This is what it looks like today. The rapid change of the screens, the ease of change, the dependence on the visual media, and these endless options, which these children don't have a way to decide whether they should or shouldn't go there, it prevents the focused attention that we need from that prefrontal concentration. There's no way to verify. There's no chronological sequence. My poor mom, I had her using an iPad because I didn't have a lot of large print books at my house, and I'm trying to ask her. She goes, well, I can't really tell you because I couldn't flip back in the pages. I couldn't remember the name of that one. I had her reading Dostoevsky and like Shakespeare or something like that. And she goes, I can't remember the name of that town. Well, you can't. You don't see any chronologic cause and effect type of thing going on. You can't make notes in the side of it, and you're not going to look up the word yourself because you just punch a button and it tells you, oh, that's what that means, but you didn't write it down. You didn't think about it. You didn't make the Latin root and the connections. So we're not creating relationships, and that's really what has to happen when you're learning, is you have to create spontaneous relationships in your mind to create another one. That's how you create that conductivity. So today, people are exposed in a 24-hour period to more sensory than a person living in the Middle Ages experienced in their entire life. I'm not saying we want to live in the Middle Ages, but it really makes you think about it. We are just so exposed to so much sensory stimulation. So what's happening is that we're getting, embedding these. When these children do this with strong emotions, and last night I was talking to my neighbor, we were over there playing basketball and talking about our son. She goes, oh, and he just loves his school teacher. And I'm going, that's not really a good thing, actually. Because it's not really good when your kids are just, his class and he loves them, because he's blending with the herd now. Do you know what I'm saying? Because I tell you what, kids will do a lot of things for some young school teacher that they really connect with and they really like, even though that person is being a broodmare for ideas and values that you really don't believe in. And that's a scary thing when these kids are connecting so much with the herd. So that they know that. That's what CASTLE is about. Heidi mentioned CASTLE. I got those documents in my purse too, and the Academy for Systemic Change one. CASTLE, by the way, the Collaboration for the Social Emotional Learning, is out of Stanford. You got to watch Stanford. Some of the things they do is good, some is bad, but remember Stanford's first founding president was also ours from IU, David Starr Jordan, Mr. Eugenics himself. He went from IU to start Stanford. Not a good thing. So anyway, what this does in the digital media is basically keeps them in the limbic system, the right brain, and the cerebellum. They're not thinking on the left side. It's very pictorial. Everything is like the photojournalism. Lead 'em and bleed 'em, okay? So behavioral conditioning, behaviors, beliefs, values, attitudes, dispositions. This is all the collective, the group think. And it becomes reflexive behaviors. They don't even think before they do something. And remember, B.F. Skinner, like John Dewey, who was America's education reformer, who was a friend of Woodrow Wilson, he embraced Darwinian evolution, and that was the idea to train people like animals. And so that's why with our Dewey system, which teachers will tell you, well, they learned about John Dewey. They were taught to kind of worship him, So this is how you get a labor force. Remember, John Dewey had told his wife Alice that he was going to get his philosophy ideas embedded in pedagogy, which is education, under the psychology department, which most of them are. And he was a Marxist. And his goals were to separate children from their parents and their parents' values. Because for Dewey, there were no absolutes. There was no truth, all was relative on his path to utopia. He actually went over to, I guess was it called Russia then, or USSR or whatever. He actually saw his methods that were being implemented over there, and he came back kind of shocked. I mean, he saw what was happening and he wasn't so happy. Now, the visual system. The sensory information that's taken in through the visual system actually floods the brain. It goes through the whole brain, every area, parietal, temporal, occipital. This is why you might have, if you go to your eye doctor, you might do a visual field. It's a poor man's MRI because it really affects every area. And so visual information literally drowns the brain, affects all those connections. And the problem is once it's in, is you really can't get it out. Those pictures are almost impossible to get rid of. I saw the movie The Birds when I was a kid, and I wish I'd never seen it. So, I'm old, but okay. So this is only one reason why you don't want to have the use of digital media, gaming, YouTubes, all those things. You've got to be really careful about that. We're losing the ability for people to linguistically read. There's a whole movement. In fact, Joy and her family is on a bus tour across the United States right now, teaching people how to read the classics again. Because people don't know how to read. They don't know the meanings of words. And so what we're finding in a lot of schools is that kids can word say, but they have nothing to refer it to. So some of them can decode and say the word, but they're not making any connection with that word. So we've got a lot of people that can't read. They've got nothing in the left brain. And these kids always ask, well, what answer do you want me to put in the blank? Do you know what I'm saying? The only reason you have these fill-in-the-blank worksheets, which are neutron bombs to thinking, is because it's easier for people to grade or for a computer to grade. You know what I'm saying? It's not about really this child expressing themselves and understanding the idea or the concept. It's all about, can you parrot the word and make sure it fits in that space? So that's not thinking. And these kids can't inhibit anything and they can't initiate anything. It all has to be a group discussion. And they can't come up with anything on their own because it's like they have to take a poll to make sure if it should say it. So the problem is they can't encode anything because everything's becoming pictorial. Everything's a YouTube, everything's a video. It's what they call them super teachers now, where they get to watch this video, but they can't summate anything on their own. They can't think about how I should take notes of this and how I could write this down and what would be a better word to use here to be articulate. So what's happening is they really don't have anything inside their brain, and this is the debasement of language. You know, Aldous Huxley spoke of that too in The Brave New World, which it's funny that's not on the reading list, because this really fits so well with The Brave New World. It's the debasement of language. People can't communicate, and that's really what makes us human, being able to communicate with one another and to communicate with God. So, you can't do the thoughtful rumination to even think about whether you should do this or not do this. And when the shift went from developing individual character based on biblical morality to developing a collectivist group instinct for a centrally planned security, it's how you get the French Revolution, it's how you get the Bolshevik Revolution, the Nazi Third Reich, the Mao Revolution, the abortion, feminist revolution, environmental religion, social justice warriors, and radical Islamic barbarism, which, you know, I thought of that today. You know, did they destroy some of Nimrod's, the artifacts from that? And it's funny because this is the Tower of Babel all over again. You know, Nimrod is the one who had begun that in one of his cities. And we're going to get the cogs in the machine. That's a great article if you haven't read it. It's how you take a nation from a virtuous, God-centered people into a depraved mobocracy, embracing totalitarian fascism, communism, or some other centrally planned globalism. And it's Fed-led ed. Did you know that the Department of Education actually funds a curriculum? It's put out by the U.S. Department of Ed, and it's called We the People. And so what they're doing is it's a whole social justice movement type of thing. I know I've got 7 textbooks of it at my house, which I don't want anyone to look at or to use, but we analyzed it and we said, oh my gosh, this is how they're changing the Constitution. Now the problem is that reading and ideas are abstract. You've got to keep something in your mind that's abstract. You cannot just be dependent on this thing all the time. So it's crippling our abilities for our people to be able to discuss and be self-governing. And most importantly, it's prohibiting people to teach themselves. People say, how'd you learn that? I say, I can read. I read, I learned this myself. I don't need to go to get some more stickers. I got plenty of those. We've all been proselytized and paid lots of money for it. And unfortunately, our parents really thought we were learning things because our parents, you know, slaved and saved money, and here they thought we were being so smart. Our parents really didn't know that we weren't learning what they had even learned. You know, that we didn't learn the history, we didn't learn the political science, we didn't learn a lot of things, but we brought home A's. the schools don't get money unless the kids get home age, you know. So we really didn't learn what our parents could transmit to us, and we need to realize that. So it's conformity, and Heidi alluded to this too, but we're all think alike, no one thinks very much. Walter Lippmann was one of Woodrow Wilson's propagandists, and I actually like some of the other things he says. One of the good ones he says too is that there is no music when the audience is deaf. It takes wisdom to understand wisdom. And there can be no liberty in a community which lacks the means by which to detect lies. Your children don't know what they don't know. They just know that they've been taught that, and they got an A for it or a sticker, and the teacher smiled at them. Nearly every CTO, nearly every chief technical officer that I know, and I have one of my neighbors works for Warren Buffett, the other neighbor is a global IBM guy, they all homeschool their children. One of our school board members in Indiana, he's a software engineer, and he tells the families, leave those iPads at the school, you do not want them in your home, because the school knows the internet protocol. And so those can be turned on. Cox and the Machine talks about that. The software in those allows them to be turned on, and they're cataloging everything the children say, do, think, even if you don't know it. So e-learning, gaming under the guise of education. Remember the word cybernetics. Cybernetics is using machines to train people. And it's forming values, dispositions, attitudes, beliefs. You do that in group settings. And those assessments, those are performing of embedded formative assessments. We're going to look at that word a little bit more, because embedded formative assessments are being used all the time in education. This isn't just about those days when they say they're doing testing. They're doing testing all the time. They're doing testing and they're doing forming all the time. They're engaging the grit, tenacity, and perseverance. There's a document on that. I think it's been scrubbed. I don't know if you can download it anymore. But again, it's inside there. The education vendors have glutted the market with the multitude of digital learning apps, computer and public education, online games, modalities, and super teachers. I laugh at that because it actually came out in, I think it was the Atlantic last week, that literally, and it confirms, teachers will be done in 5 years. There won't be a need for teachers. I hope teachers realize that. There's no need. There'll be facilitators that are paid $15 an hour, maybe. But actually in Indiana, the kids do e-learning days from home. They don't even go in. If there's a snow day, they didn't go into school at all. They're making up snow days even by having them just do e-learning at home. They don't need the teachers anymore. So what's happening is there's real life mediation going on, and it's gauging the values, the tenacity, and shaping those as well. And you wonder what worldview is being uploaded. Well, we all know that the artificial intelligence is self-adapting. And so this is actually putting in the logic of the program, the logic of the system. E-learning, and I'm going to have one of the things on here. So most parents don't have a clue as to what's going on, but this is one of the games that is used. And it's funny because one of our friends mentioned this name, but the teacher, when you interview her, all she says is, they're so engaged. Well, they're engaged in what? What are they engaged in? But if you read the title here, it's Transforming Learning and Formative Assessment Through Digital Games. And now the funny thing is about games, it's exactly what Hitler and Mussolini used. That's Hitler youth, that's Balila. You think you're having fun, and this really isn't learning, but you actually learn a lot more by doing it as a game. So they were very smart about that. So, and we're having a problem with episodic grasp of reality. The digital media looks so real. This looks so real that people are having trouble telling, is that real or is that not real? So, you know what, this goes on all the time. So this is what we're going to have is the monkeys, although it's just going to be screens. You know, we have a screen there and another one. But actually that happens. When you see something being done, there are mirror neurons in the brain. And this is why these young men that played the video games and went out and shot people, well, they really had developed the abilities to do that by watching it so much, by doing it and practicing it. And that creates their own reality. Whatever you focus on, remember that focused attention, it develops dendritic connections. It doesn't have to be real necessarily, but you think it's real. The more one focuses on anything, the more that becomes reality to them. And this is one of the things that parents have to realize. You have got to be the ones to tell your children, because the government will get to them first. And it's very hard to backtrack. It's because it puts you in a position of trying to climb up the mountain and they're on the top already. This is what schools look like. We were in one just like this a couple months ago. You know, they all have their iPads. So these assessments do much more than collect data or present information. They don't only evaluate what exists, but now they are using artificial intelligence. What they're doing is they're shaping the minds, behaviors, reflexes, attitudes, the assessment's design. It's designing this in love, this breeding to a common cause, the creed of the state. And this is literally from one of their websites. Quote, if we think of our children as plants, summative assessment of the plants is process of simply measuring them, how high they are. The measurement might be interesting to compare and analyze, but in itself, it does not affect the growth of the plant. On the other hand, formative assessment is the garden equivalent of feeding and watering the plants, directly affecting their growth. You know, C.S. Lewis's analogy of this is in The Abolition of Man, which you haven't read it lately, you need to go back and read it. But it's basically, it's the poultry worker making these chickens for purposes they don't know what they're going to be used for. He actually recognized back then that the new education media, by those two guys, he gave them the names of Gaius and something else with their little green book, was actually what was being used as propaganda by what he called the conditioners. It's exactly what we have. Embedded means part of the game, stealth. It's not recognized by the gamer, the student, or the parents, the student's parents. Again, quoting the gaming site, when embedded assessments are so seamlessly woven into the fabric of the learning environment that they are virtually invisible, we call this stealth assessment. And such stealth assessment can be accomplished via automated scoring and machine-based reasoning techniques to infer things that would be too hard for humans. Example, estimating values of evidence-based competencies across a network of skills. Well, who gets to define what an evidence-based competency is? Who gets to decide the ends? By their means. So we're going to decide what is good on an SAT score, Mr. David Coleman and all of the rest of you. Formative, meaning the digital program is recognizing the student's responses, methods, actions, and the digital e-learning is adaptively providing the programmed reward. Bing! You just got to hit a dopamine. You're so good. You're so smart. And the next level of challenge, to continue to form and monitor the student's responses seamlessly without the student being aware. Cybernation. This is machines making people. Assessments are ongoing, and they're not directed by the teacher, and they're defined by the software engineers, or whoever's paying the software engineers based on their criteria and their worldview. Jurassic Park. God help us, we're in the hands of engineers. I tell you, there's a lot of truth to that one. And it's too bad because the engineers are just being told what to do, like the Germans were told what to do. They weren't thinking. So the problem is, if your child isn't a conformist, if your child thinks outside the box, or wants to think at all, or your worldview is not acceptable, you're not going to score too high in the SAT, the ACT, any of that, the PISA. But don't worry, because your child will be profiled, camped, that's what the concentration camps are for, and conformed either way, unless you don't play the game. These assessments are being used, in public education all the time, and the parents don't realize what's happening. Here are some of the names that they use even in the schools in Indiana. Minecraft, ABC, MobyMax, Oblivion, all that. In fact, they assign the kids to work on these at home. They have them after hours that they have to go. And one of the school principals told parents, said, we see your children haven't been doing their hour of ABC yet. And she's like, well, our system doesn't hook up good. And he said, we'll take care of that for you. They're monitoring individual children to see how much time they're spending on doing this at home. Wow. Yes, wow. So remember, Dewey's goals were to separate children from the values of their parents and from their parents in general. And again, Dewey and Skinner were all influenced by Pavlov, Dewey, Thorndike, Skinner, Vygotsky. All of these guys are all kind of in the same thing, but their names have changed to Mark Tucker, to Bill Gates, to the Hewlett Foundation, to the Lumina Foundation, which is actually based in Indianapolis. There's absolutely no way to protect you or your child's personal information, performance, test scores, or any activity on electronic media. If you want 500 cited notations, go read Cogs in the Machine. Joy Pullman was one of the authors of that, Emmett McGroarty and Jane Robbins. Go pull the thing down. I've got a copy of it with me here too. There's absolutely no way. There's no way you can get anonymity in any of this. The only protection is to keep your kids off of the electronic media. Once it's out there, even if you don't know it's turned on, it's in there. So this is clearly social engineering. This is education married to psychology. You know that education has been under the psychology department for a long time, and use of research is very bogus. It's hardly what you would call scientific research. It's all public, it's all opinions. It's how they get their ideas. And this is neuroscience, and this is neurobiology, and this is conformity. I'm about done because you guys have been so good, and I know this is a hard one to listen to, but the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Remember, it was then President Bill Clinton who had signed this, and Hillary had already championed for it before that, but she's been championing for its ratification for 20 years now. And within this convention, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, if it's signed, it is signed, if it's ratified, it was signed in 1995. If it's ratified, parents will legally not be able to interrupt, moderate, filter, monitor, or disrupt their child's access to internet or digital media. This is huge. This is huge. Parents will not be able to interrupt that legally. So, you know what? We were in the Values Voter Summit a year or two ago, and Gary Bauer says it like it is. You remember, he started Family Research Council. He worked in the Reagan administration. And the first year we went, he said openly at the luncheon, he said, you know what? The radical left has partnered with radical Islam to destroy their mutual enemy, Judeo-Christian civilization. I thought, whoa, that's pretty bold. Yeah, but we'd all been thinking it, just wouldn't have said it, with 100 people in the room. And then last year, he told us, he said, you need to be teaching your children about civil disobedience. You know what? This is true. So, bringing it around, we have a 21st century youth today in the war zone. Faith has become pagan environmentalism, global fascism. It's back to the old Prussians worshiping the oak trees, which they literally did. You remember the Teutonic Knights, they chopped all those things down. Family is the paternal state's global village. The future, now this is what's interesting to watch. All these politicians, I know we have some here, but all these politicians, businessmen, everyone is stratifying for their area of where they're going to be in control. This is how it goes. It's the top system. It's not the bottom down system. It's the top down system. So everybody is going to get their position here. They're all going to be behavioral conditioned for rewards. And there's going to be perpetual debt and dependence. And the freedom is going to be denied. Because you know what? Whenever you dethrone Christ, whenever you take Christ off the throne, Caesar will take his place. And do you remember what the Romans are? So, human or post-human, we're going to have to decide. If we're going to aspire to develop virtuous human beings created in the image of God and the likeness of God, rather than technology-formatted, mechanized animals, then human parents must resume their God-given responsibility of parenting their children. Because the parents are going to answer to God for the culture that is transmitted to their children. And ultimately, we all will. It's time to choose. We wrote Time to Choose because my mom started having flashbacks when Obama ran the first time. She said, Dawn, this is just like when we were under Hitler. Don't people realize it? I said, Mom, they don't. The history has not been transmitted to them for them to be able to see that. And so we'll be available afterwards if anybody wants to talk. Leave you with some sunshine there.